let's just dive right in. There's been a lot of talk about the 2024 election, and, well, some are even saying Trump might have another shot at the presidency.
Yeah, it's definitely got people talking.
And, we always like to get ahead of the curve here, so today we thought we'd take a deep dive into, well, what a hypothetical second Trump term could mean. What are the potential impacts, especially when it comes to things like civil rights, global relations, the stuff that really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to say right off the bat, we're not making any predictions here.
Oh, absolutely not. We're not fortune tellers.
Right, exactly. But we can look at the potential consequences, right? We can kind of game it out a little, see what various experts and analysts are saying.
Exactly. Connect the dots. So let's start with something that's, well, it's already a hot topic. Domestic policy. Specifically, voting rights.
Okay, sure. So when you look at the sources, there's this concern, right, that a second Trump term could mean, well, even stricter voting laws. And we're talking on a state level, mostly.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does that look like in real life, these stricter laws?
Well, it could be a lot of things, like stricter voter ID laws, or maybe changes to early voting periods, making it harder for people to, to actually cast their ballot. Even things like where polling places are located, that kind of thing.
And while those might seem like, just logistical changes, they could have a real impact on, well, who actually gets to vote, right?
Exactly. And many argue that these changes, while they're often framed as ways to increase election integrity, could actually disproportionately impact minority voters.
Making it harder for them to have their voices heard. And it's not just about voting rights, is it? We're also talking about potential impacts on minority rights more broadly.
Absolutely. There's a lot of concern about potential rollbacks of protections for the LGBTQ plus community, especially considering, well, some of the policy changes we saw during the previous administration.
Right. There's a history there for sure.
Exactly. And another area that's, well, it's got people worried is affirmative action. Those policies that have been so important for creating opportunities for marginalized groups in education and employment.
And what are you hearing about that? What's the potential impact there?
Well, some sources suggest that a second Trump term could lead to a weakening of these policies. And, practically speaking, that could mean fewer students from underrepresented backgrounds getting into college or, facing more hurdles in the job market. It could impact diversity across the board, really.
So we're talking about a potential shift in the landscape of opportunity itself. And, we can't talk about potential shifts without mentioning immigration. It was such a defining issue of Trump's first term. What are the sources saying about a second term?
Right. Well, a lot of them point to even stricter immigration policies, which, if you look back at U.S. history, isn't really surprising.
Right. We've seen those patterns before.
Exactly. Like with the Chinese Exclusion Act back in the 1880s or the Emergency Quota Act in the 1920s. Periods of economic uncertainty or, well, frankly, times when fear takes hold, we often see these restrictive measures popping up.
And are we potentially looking at a resurgence of those sentiments now?
Well, it's certainly something to consider, right? Especially given the current political climate. We're not saying it's going to happen, but, it's a possibility. And with immigration, any potential shift in policy has such huge implications, for so many people's lives.
Absolutely. It's about real people, real families. And speaking of impactful institutions, this potential shift in the political climate, it could have a major impact on the judicial branch, too. Right. Specifically, the Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, think about it. If Trump gets another term, he could appoint even more judges to the Supreme Court and to lower federal courts, too.
And those are lifetime appointments, right?
Exactly. We're not just talking about 4 years here. We're talking about shaping the interpretation of the Constitution for, well, potentially generations to come. And that has implications for everything, reproductive rights, environmental regulations, you name it.
It's like, you throw a pebble in a pond and the ripples just keep going.
That's a great way to put it.
And speaking of ripples, let's talk about another area where we've already got some choppy waters. Freedom of speech.
Yeah. Okay, so with this one, the sources are interesting. They point to a potential for increased tension, between a hypothetical Trump administration and, well, media outlets that are critical of his policies.
Okay, so basically more of what we've already seen, just, well, amplified.
Potentially, yeah. And it's not just about, political spats and Twitter wars. It gets at something really fundamental, which is, the role of a free press in a functioning democracy.
Right. It's bigger than just Trump.
Exactly. And it's not just traditional media either. Our sources also highlight the potential for more debates around social media regulation,
Right.
like what constitutes free speech online, what should be allowed, that kind of thing.
It's a whole other can of worms, really.
It really is.
Yeah, and it's not just the domestic scene, right? I mean, things can get really interesting on the global stage, too, with the second Trump term. One of the biggest question marks, at least for me, is Ukraine. What happens there? What does U.S. foreign policy even look like in that scenario?
Yeah, it's a big one for sure. And the sources, they kind of paint a range of potential scenarios. Some
Yeah.
suggest we could see like decreased financial and military aid to Ukraine.
Okay, so less support, basically.
Right. And then there are others who say, well, it could go even further, like a complete rethinking of U.S. involvement altogether.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, Trump's past statements and actions regarding Ukraine and Putin. He's expressed skepticism about U.S. support for Ukraine before, and he's even, praised Putin's leadership.
Right. Which obviously raised a lot of eyebrows at the time.
For sure. And, his whole approach to foreign policy, it's often been about personal relationships, deal making.
Right. That kind of like businessman diplomacy.
Exactly. So that could definitely mean a very different approach compared to the current administration's stance.
So we've got the current administration taking a really strong stance against Russia. And then you're saying, hypothetically, a second Trump term might mean what? A more hands-off approach.
Yeah.
Or even,
Well, some would even say a more conciliatory one, yeah.
yeah,
Potentially, yeah. And that could mean concessions, things that some people might see as, well, controversial for sure.
right. A lot of people would definitely have something to say about that.
Hmm.
But Ukraine's just one piece of the puzzle. What about the rest of the world? Like China, North Korea. How might those relationships play out in a second Trump term?
Well, it's interesting because if you look back at his first term, Trump often took this, well, some would say unconventional approach to foreign policy. Like he really favored those bilateral agreements,
Yeah.
direct negotiations, often over those traditional multilateral institutions.
Right. More like one-on-one deal.
Exactly. So with North Korea, we could see more of that, more summits, maybe direct talks with Kim Jong-un, trying to strike some kind of deal.
Okay. So that could be a continuation of what we've already seen.
Potentially, yeah. And then there's China. I mean, the trade war, the tensions over Taiwan, all of that suggests that a second Trump administration, well, it could mean a continuation of that confrontational approach. And that, of course, has huge implications for the global economy, for global security. It's a big deal.
Yeah, no kidding. So from potential shifts in alliances to like a fundamental rethinking of America's role in the world, it seems like the international stage could be a very, well, unpredictable place if Trump returns to the White House. But let's bring it back home for a minute. All of this, it's not just happening in a vacuum, right? It has real implications for American society.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest concerns that comes up over and over again in the sources is this polarization. The potential for even deeper divisions within American society.
Which is kind of scary considering how divided things already feel, right?
Actually. And what they're saying is a second Trump term, it could just exacerbate that, make it even harder to find common ground, to address, the challenges that we're facing as a country.
Right, because we're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. And on top of that, we can't talk about a potential second Trump term without talking about election integrity. I mean, it's the elephant in the room.
Definitely the big one. Go on.
Well, we saw what happened after the 2020 election, right? All those questions, those challenges. And, it's highly likely that those debates would resurface, and they could be even more intense this time around.
Okay, so more of the same, but potentially even more heated.
Potentially, yeah. And that just further erodes trust in the democratic process, right? Which is the last thing we need.
It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. And speaking of things that could get heated, what about the different branches of government? How might they interact, especially if you've got, say, a Democrat-controlled Congress and Trump back in the White House?
Oh, man, yeah. That's a recipe for some potential fireworks, for sure. I mean, the system of checks and balances, that's the bedrock of U.S. government, right?
Huh.
But what happens when those checks and balances, when they become like flashpoints for conflict?
Right, when the system that's supposed to keep things in check is what's causing the chaos.
Exactly. And that's what some experts are worried about, that a second Trump term, especially with a divided Congress, could just lead to more gridlock, more confrontations, potentially even, some kind of constitutional crisis.
Wow. So we're talking about potential court battles, legislative stalemates, the whole 9 yards.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a sure thing, but it's definitely something that people are thinking about, as we head into this next election cycle.
And it's a lot to process, for sure. But you know what I find interesting in all of this? It's so easy to get caught up in the speculation, the what ifs, But at the end of the day, we're not just powerless bystanders here.
That's a good point.
Like, we have a role to play in how this all shakes out, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that I find really empowering about, looking at these potential scenarios is remembering that they're not inevitable. The future isn't set in stone.
So we've talked about all these potential scenarios, but how do we, shift gears? How do we go from just thinking about this stuff to actually doing something? What can our listeners do?
Well, the good news is the sources actually offer some pretty concrete ideas. And it starts with, well, it might seem obvious, but voting. Making sure you're registered, informed about the issues, the candidates. That's huge.
Right, because it all starts with participation, right? If you're not engaged, then, well, you're kind of leaving it up to everyone else.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just voting, too. I mean, being an active citizen, that can look like a lot of things. Maybe you join a local organization or, attend a town hall meeting. Even just having those tough conversations with people who see things differently than you do, that's important, too.
Right. Bridging those divides, finding that common ground. It's not always easy, but it's so important.
Totally. And then there's education. We're bombarded with information these days. So being able to cut through the noise, figure out what's reliable, what's accurate, that's more important than ever.
It's like you got to be your own fact checker these days in a way.
Right. Exactly. And then for those who are able, financial support can be a powerful tool too, whether that's donating to a political campaign you believe in or supporting an organization that's, on the ground, working on the issues you care about.
Right, putting your money where your mouth is. It's one thing to talk the talk, but walking the walk, that's how you really make a difference.
Exactly. And I think what it all boils down to is remembering that, in a democracy, we're not just along for the ride. We're not just watching it all happen. We have agency, Our choices, big and small, they actually shape how things turn out.
And that brings me to something I've been thinking about a lot as we've been, having this conversation. It's so easy to get caught up in the immediate impacts, right? Like, what happens in the next 4 years if Trump gets reelected? But what about the long game? What about the world we're leaving to our kids, our grandkids?
Man, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, but when we talk about things like voting rights, like minority rights, like the future of the planet, we're talking about something much bigger. We're talking about legacy, the legacy that we leave behind.
It's a lot of responsibility when you think about it that way.
It is, but it's also, it's kind of empowering too, because it means we have a chance to actually build something, to be architects of the future.
I like that. Architects of the future. That's good.
So to our listeners, as you're, thinking about all of this, as you're having those conversations, as you're figuring out what you want to do, here's a question to leave you with. What kind of future do you want to be a part of building? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
Now, those are questions worth pondering.
They really are. And on that note, we'll leave you to do just that. This has been a deep dive, and, it's been a journey. But we're glad you joined us for it. And until next time, keep those minds curious, those hearts open, and those voices heard.